Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Third International Conference of Emerging Power Technologies. Today, we are here to present our work on data-driven modeling for lithium-ion battery life cycle for capacity degradation. And this was the work was done with the collaboration of some of my colleagues at USPK's NUST and some of the colleagues at University of Vermont. So let's dive deep into it. So the primary question is why lithium-ion batteries? Pretty straightforward. This is that lithium-ion batteries are one of the most promising and prominent industry concern in this batteries these days, and these are being used for one of the greatest uh, space applications to EV charging applications and wave trapper avionics and solar power energy solutions. And having said that, so why lithium-ion are the best of all, or we can say why lithium-ion is the lions of all the battery industry, because they have a high energy density, smaller size and weight. They have longer cycles and fast charging capabilities, low self-discharge and cost per kilowatt. Specifically in this paper, we're going to stick with two of the aspects of lithium-ion batteries, which we want to have our paper focus on, which is the long life cycles and fast charging capabilities, and we'll talk specifically how our data-driven model can actually model these two features quite accurately. All right, so the inspiration for the work we took was from this paper, which was published in Nature, data-driven prediction for battery life cycle, and the data set they used were used by MIT and Stanford Labs Energy Research Group lab. There was like a aerospace battery which they were using, and they accumulated that data set that they presented online, publicly available, and we use the same data set for our newer experiments, and yeah, we use those. Why it is a hard problem to have a forecast or having a model for a lithium-ion battery? Because one of the reason is charging and discharging for the lithium-ion batteries are extremely non-linear behavior, and that's why, as comes the point two, that they are produced in different batches, and every batch has a different kind of bias towards the model. So it's very hard to fit one mathematical or stochastical model to forecast the kind of non-linearity lithium-ion batteries shares. And the third point, which is our USP for our paper, which is like we tested these batteries for fast charging conditions. So once we have like all the one and 2 points there, if you add the third point, which is the fast charging condition, it makes the behavior extremely nonlinear, and where we see like all the stochastical and the Kalman filter approaches fail to operate, and that's why we used machine learning and deep learning models here. So a little description of the data set. So it's a complex data sets which has a snapshot data set, and there is a detailed time series data sets of all the features. So it's divided, like there are two basic parts of this data set when we filtered it out. So one is the summary data set or snapshot data set, in which we just focused on 7 features for every cycle, for every battery per cycle, and there was a raw data in which we take 8 features, which you can see on the right. So all these variables were treated as features, and these were like time series. So these were not snapshots of one variable. So for example, that is current. So for current, for the first cycle, we have like a whole time series instead of just a value for average current that throws in. So that makes like the summary data set like a snapshot, and the raw data is like a detailed version of everything. So there were totally 125 batteries, and in these 125 there were 3 batches out of it. So you can divide like almost 40s for each battery, in 40s, 41, 42 something. We can share it later. And then we did just the initial EAD analysis, some basic cleanings with z-scores, outlier removal, and then we found out that some of the features were actually repeating and having the same redundant information. So we have to remove those information. Some of the features we manipulated and created by our own with existing features, and some of them were removed. Then the analysis goes to the first part, which is the random forest part. And this is based on the summary data set. Let me remind you that summary data is the snapshot of every cycle that happens in a battery for all the 125 cycles. So it does not share the details, time series information of every charging conditions. And yeah, so having said that, we formalize this data set, use a threefold validation, 80-20 split, and then we go for further split. So there are three kinds of experiment which we did on random forest. So first experiment which we designed for the random forest was how to select. The question was how to select a model, and there were various approaches, and it can be chosen like in a very random way. So we choose like three different ways that can address the possibility of good forecast initially, and that was train and test battery over itself. So we fed random forest some of the data for the battery itself, and it was able to forecast for the battery itself. But the problem is, so this approach we call is like each battery against itself. So in this approach, the problem is like the model is not general, and it's highly unlikely that it's a good training example, because yeah, of course we want a general model that can forecast over all kind of batteries, and for that we come for the second experiment, which was choosing the best model. So we call it one model fits all. So we choose the best model for the battery that can fit all, and that was treated as a general model for all the batteries. And third experiment was like the average model approach. So we trained for each model, and then we have an average model that can forecast like for all. Among the three, the highest accuracy was for the third one, which is the average modeling one. So the figure on the left shows like one battery against itself, and it shows pretty promising results. Of course, because like it's being trained by itself, so it's highly likely that the model's gonna random forest gonna fit in. But if you see for the batch, the error in the midsection, that is batch 2, is quite high than the first and the last batch, which shows like the middle part, which is in the red, which shows like there is some extreme non-linearity in the batch 2, which is not present in 1 and batch 3. And that's why we were anticipating some difference of nature when we were doing work with batch 2, of course. And yeah, so if you see the diagram on the left, that's like the one model fits all, and that seems like quite high error, because if you fix one battery model to all, of course it's going to have a little bit collinearity with each model of individual batteries, but still I would say it will have a lot of error in comparative to a very good model. And then we applied the average model, and average model works best among these three methods on random forest. And it fits quite well. But if you see after almost 100,000 cycle, the forecast goes off. And that's actually quite identical with the idea which we talked earlier. That is, there is some non-linearity present in the batch 2, and which is evident here that for all the batteries that exceeds 1,000 cycle, the average model failed to explain the reason. So before 1,000 cycles kind of accurate or have a low variance, but after that the variance overflows, or there is a bias towards the system which might not be present in our features which were on which it be trained on. So this analysis, we thought about using deep learning or LSTM approach. The reason being, as we see in the last slide, there are different phases in the training, because before 1,000 cycle there is a different relation, and after 1,000 cycle the behavior changes, and we want our algorithm or our model to not just try to fit in with the all data, but it has should have a capability of a long-term and short-term visibility of and adapting to the visibility, been happening there. And that's why we use this LSTM, because and we adjusted the forget gate, so every time it goes into the next kind of patch, it retrains it. And yeah, we did some work on this. Um, so this is kind of a memory based algorithm we used, quite popular these days, um, and it really worked. Yeah, so we initially we did a dry run for most of the data we have. So the features, we use the same clean features, and we took a time step or time window for 30 batch size 32 and epoch of yeah, and epoch per battery for 5. And then VC was like, this model is quite being fitted to what we wanted to do and without a very high variance. And that's how our dry run for the whole data feels like this is a promising technique. And then we raised the question, which is actually a very practical and industrial question, that if I have the data for, do I have the data for the whole battery? Like, if I have the data for the whole battery, for the entire battery, that means that I have already consumed the battery. And then even if you know how many cycles the battery is going to last, it's useless because you already used it. And so that's kind of an existential question in this whole research. And then we figure out, okay, so maybe we can use like first cycles, like first 10%, for 5%, for 7% of the cycles of the battery, and we observe it, fed it to an our model, and then our model can give us like the expectancy for how many cycles it can go for. So that's like a promising result, and shows like a promising result to the industry partners as well, because they don't want to like overly consume these batteries. Just if they can look at 10% or 7%, 5% cycles, they would have a confidence bound to say that this battery is going to last for that much longer. And that's like a practical application, and that's like what the niche of the paper discusses. So first we did the same experiment with all the settings being there with the dropout rate of zero point 0.2. So it has a forget gate active there. And we used a p equals to 10%, which means like we just trained our model on 10% of the of the 10% of the data we have for the entire batteries. And just by training on 10% of the data or 10% of the cycles, it can forecast like how much information, or 10% of the percentage of data visibility there, it can forecast like for how much longer this is going to last. And um, so that's how we predicted the end of life of the battery. And the rest is um, so so one correction, so 10% is the rated capacity, not the cycle. So if you have like 10% of the rated capacity, you can forecast it. Yeah. And these were the activation function. We use 10 hat, and optimizer we use Adams and MSC, of course. And so we compared all these different scenarios in which we first put it to 5% visibility. We fed or trained our model for 5% of the rated cycle, 7% and 10%. And we see like, even though we have a very good score for 10%, but even if we go like for 5%, it's a good model to forecast. So it's like 0.95 of R squared error, R squared, and mean squared error is quite low in that. So the point is being like, even we have like 5% of the rated cycle capacity data we've fed into our model. So it gives a promising results of how longer this battery is gonna live. And that's the practical application we were focusing on. So this was one part of it. And then we go for the deep cycle analysis for the stack data. And this was exactly the opposite data set we were using, like the secondary data set, which was a detailed data set we were talking about. And we were just curious, and we were wanted to figure out like, maybe we can use some time series and maybe have some LSTM train over it, so it can have a forecasting loop. And just by click, we have a more accurate result that can actually works as a validation for our first. So what we did was we combined all the battery set data set as a single data set. So we can see like these red peaks going up and down. These are different batteries. And among this peak, one peak, if you zoom out, there are different charging cycles, charging, discharging, charging, and discharging. So these are 125 cycles in red peaks. And among each peak, there is like number of cycles for one battery that is being charged and discharged. And of course, was a very costly algorithm because it took a lot of time to be trained on because that was a huge data set. And what we were forecasting here was not actually cycles. We were actually doing it indirectly. We wanted to map or forecast the discharge capacity for the cycles, and with discharge capacity, we wanted to forecast cycles. So it's kind of an indirect loop away so that we might not have a bias towards what we trained earlier, so the validation could work around. So that was the intention. So every time when the QD, which is the discharge capacity, dropped 80%, we counted at one cycle. And how do we detect this cycle? We use this detection algorithm. When every time this charging and discharging cycles goes, the QD, the discharge capacity, goes below 80, considered as one cycle. So every time it works like a counter for everyone, for everything. And then we showed them some data set and allowed it to forecast the rest of the data set. So this is the blue one is actually the forecasted data set. And on the forecasted data set, we still have the same peaks, the big peaks, which represent the batteries, and within those peaks where there are small peaks, which represents the cycle per battery. So now we have the whole formation in red, which was the actual data, and now in the blue, which is the forecasted data. And then we plugged in this this detection algorithm, which actually counts for 80%, and it works like a counter and counts the number of cycle for it. And the result was quite promising, and it worked like a validation for previous algorithm, and both of them works like a validation and active method. But primarily the second method on the deep cycle is quite costly, so we don't consider it as a primary, but as a source of like a validation for the method. So in a nutshell, what we summarize here is like we use three random forest approaches: battery against itself, average model, and an AUC classifier, which was not part of this paper, but still we are working on it. The rest is like an LSTM based paper, LSTM based parametric data for 5%, 7%, and 10%. And then the last one was like LSTM over the deep cycle data, or like the detailed time series data. So both works as I said, the validation against itself. Right. And so the future work. So here, if we see like the most of the work is being done in the available features, which were discharge and charge capacities. And some of the features that were used there to have a snapshot of the data was on the default on the data set was max and average. But some of the feature I think we used were the derivatives. We actually there were actually derived features. So I think one of the future ahead would be to use more derived features like area under the curve. As I said, we're working on some of the logistic algorithms or logistic models that use area under the curve, or some other averaging model techniques, moving average techniques, or Hilbert envelope techniques. So those can be used on this data to have a better understanding of not just the average, but the dynamics on long term and short term. So that's looks like a promising work. And the second is, of course, these parameters were like first ahead parameters observed from the battery directly, but even we have these parameters, we can calculate some derived variables like state of health and state of charge, and instead of like training the algorithm on QD and QC, that is the charge capacity and discharge capacity, we can charge them from the derived features, which are state of health and state of charge, and that will be like, I think, more conventionally acceptable in the power system, in the energy system community, because mostly they model with respect to SOC and SOH. And these were some of the references we worked on. There are others, some references, but these were the primary ones we looked into. And yeah, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and please let me know if you have any questions. I have attached my email with the conference and the paper. Please let me know if you have any questions, or yeah, looking forward to any kind of collaborations. Thank you. Bye bye.